Of all the keys, none is perhaps as much associated with Beethoven as the key of C minor. The beginning of the Pathétique, the third piano concerto, the overture to Coriolan, the Fifth Symphony, of course, and on and on and on, the last sonata, number 32. It is so easy to connect the highly strung, high-intensity, dramatic, turbulent mood which fills the music which Beethoven wrote in this key with the portraits that we have of him. Beethoven with a stormy brow, Beethoven looking slightly grouchy, grumpy, angry even. This image, both of Beethoven the man and of Beethoven the creator, really had a strong effect on the imagination of the Romantic generation that came after him. And I think it's not by chance that the most popular of the 5 piano concerti was not the Emperor in the 19th century, not the highly poetic number 4, but the C minor concerto number 3. Inside the sonata cycle, several of the sonatas are in this key. The Pathétique, as I mentioned, the last one, number 32, and also an earlier sonata, number 5, opus 10, number 1. And this sonata is sometimes nicknamed the small Pathétique because the two do share some characteristics. Apart from being in C minor, they are both compact works in 3 movements, without a 4th movement, without a scherzo or a minuet, as he used to write in his Grand Sonate, like the 3 sonatas opus 2 or the sonata opus 7 that were more symphonic in scope. These two, the Pathétique and number 5, are in the more traditional model, which was often used by Mozart as well, of 3 movements, fast, slow and fast. Moreover, the slow movements in both the Pathétique and number 5 are in the key of A flat major, and that is a soft key in Beethoven's musical vocabulary. Also in the Fifth Symphony he chose to write the slow movement in that key. That is a key which perhaps for him was the biggest contrast to the intensity and dark drama of the outer movements in C minor, and he needed the softness of A flat major to offset it. But in my opinion, designating the sonata number 5 as the small Pathétique does a disservice to it, because it immediately makes us think that it is nothing but an early, less successful attempt of what later would become one of his greatest masterpieces. It is but a harbinger, but a precursor, so something which is not quite complete in itself, something which is not quite mature. And I think this is not the case. Moreover, more than 2 years separate the two sonatas, and I find it highly unlikely that Beethoven, while making the preliminary sketches and then finally writing the final score of sonata number 5, already knew that in 2 years' time he will go on to write the Pathétique. His output was very rich, he wrote very quickly, and those 2 years were filled with various works which he composed, so it is not that this led directly to the Pathétique and we can say, this was a first step, and then he immediately followed by the Pathétique. And lastly, I do think that the two works are quite different in their musical flavor and aftertaste. This is harder to put in words, but even the slow movements, both of them lyrical in A flat major, but they have a very different character. The slow movement of the Pathétique is some kind of song, a flowing melody gently accompanied by semiquavers. It could have been closer to music by Schubert in its singing character. Whereas the slow movement of sonata number 5 is a magical, timeless, still landscape, dreamy, not really flowing, and the feeling that you have listening to the two movements is very, very different. And also the first movement, the dark depths of the introduction of the Pathétique are nowhere to be found in the first movement of the earlier Sonata number 5. And it's not that it's trying to do the same thing and not quite achieving it. The way that the sonata starts has absolutely nothing to do with the kind of inner drive which permeates the fast part of the first movement of the Pathetique, nor with the real true pathos that that permeates the opening, the slow introduction. It is as if the concept behind the two works is very, very different. If anything, the closest link lies in the two finales that are both very fast, both very energetic, and both feature second subjects that are surprisingly humorous or light in comparison to the main subject of the movement. So, to sum this all up, I think it's much more exciting to value the sonata for itself and not for its links, real or unreal, with the Pathetique. The first movement, even though it is in C minor, is surprisingly light for most of its length. So it is just the very beginning which is dramatic. So we have this opening chord and a rocketing motive with jagged rhythms. But then it is immediately contrasted with something which is very personal and imploring. And again. So these two motives, the dramatic, the turbulent, but immediately offset or contrasted with something which is very close to one's heart, that is introduced right in the first bars. And this motive, the softer one, that is what a large part of the movement will be centered around. Another thing which he introduces here in the beginning is this idea of a triple repetition. So he starts once, second time, and a third time. And again, once, twice, and a third time. This idea of the first two appearances of any idea could be hesitant, soft, not quite sure where they're going, and then the third one is the decisive one, the one that says, yes, this is what it is. But then after those first few lines, the second subject is very lyrical and much closer in its mood to this part of the opening, and moreover it is in a major key. It is in the key of A flat major, which later will become the key of the second movement, so this is already foreshadowed here. Then there is a transition, and then the second subject is really very far away from the opening. It is bright, but not as lyrical as the not quite as lyrical as this right hand might suggest, because the left hand is accompanying with a lot of energy here. So it's once again a clash of two ideas: the driven one, the left hand, and the more singing cantabile in the right hand. And so it continues, and the rest of the exposition is all in a major key. We have a bit of a dramatic grumble here. And then the motive which we had at first in a minor key, here is in a major. and a little closing section. Which once again is closer to the lyrical mood of the second part of the opening. And it also introduces an idea of an independent left hand, which will get an immediate development in the development section. The development section takes the opening and transforms it from C minor to C major. And then Beethoven introduces what is effectively a completely new melody in the key of F minor at first. So it follows the same pattern as we had here. That is a left hand which is driven and energetic, and the right hand which is more lyrical and singing, but the melody itself is different. This bit is a little bit related to this. Not quite, but it comes from the same genetic, from the same musical DNA. But interestingly, the effect of this together is effectively of a new melody here. And again, in a more distant key, B flat minor. Here he writes. So bizarre, why? This is an octave. And in the middle, one note is just on its own. The answer is that he did not have this key on his keyboard. At the time, this F was the highest note that he had available, so he could not write this note. But of course, on our modern day pianos, we can play this. And this dilemma of whether to complement what he has written with the notes which we have and he did not is one that sometimes is problematic, because in some passages the very limitation of the keyboard drove him to finding very inventive and innovative solutions. But here in this case, where it's literally one note that's all of a sudden is written as a single note, I believe that we can allow ourselves this extra G flat and play the whole passage in octaves. Similar to here. Play it. And then this left hand, which I mentioned, the independent left hand, will now get quite an interesting line. So quite interesting to listen to it just on its own. And then together with the melody here. But you can probably feel that the entire mood of this development is not of this kind, but much closer to this. So something which is quite warm and personal and not dramatic and extrovert. And then only in the reprise, the place where in the exposition he wrote a bright and light second subject, it first starts like this in the reprise, the same. But then a little bit later, rather than going to the codetta in a major key, here he comes back to the minor. Here. And then he repeats the same subject, this time in minor and in octaves. this is something which Mozart used to do to great effect. A melody which appeared in a major key in the exposition would then come back in a minor key in the reprise, changing its color, changing its emotional and psychological impact on us, the listeners. We recognize this as the melody which we heard before, but if before it was optimistic, this time it is much darker, and it is as if it was unable to escape the main key of the movement and the main mood of the movement, which is dark. So it is the same material which we had in the exposition, but all in a minor key, and this dramatic rumble and this independent left hand is once again in a minor key, and the movement does end with the same decisive, energetic way in which it began. From that world, he passes to one of the most beautiful second movements of his early works. His second movements, right from the first sonata, were always full of beauty, lyrical beauty, poetic beauty, a search, a quest for some escape from whatever drama or turbulence we had in the first movements, or even the energy of the first movements if the sonata was in a major key. And here in this sonata, he achieves it in a most magical way. It is extremely slow, adagio molto, and it has a sense of timelessness, of being out of flow of time standing still. You can feel the atmosphere, the mood of this beautiful, serene relaxation, a moment in which we completely forget all the troubles that we had in the first movement and we are transported somewhere else. Interestingly, this moment here, this idea of a jagged rhythm going upwards, is of course directly related to just in the context of A flat major and this beautiful stillness. Throughout the movement, we do not really leave this mood for long. Sometimes he would introduce some kind of ornamentation to these passages. Sometimes he introduces moments of decisive, I wouldn't say dramatic, but energetic statements. Every single time, after a few bars of this, he brings the mood back. Like here, for example, when he goes into an, if anything, a more beautiful passage. It is really beautiful writing, the slow, soft pulsation in the left hand, and above it a right hand, which is, even though it's in pianissimo, it is still cantabile singing, and it's just glowing with a soft poetic light. There is a moment of, once again, of yearning upwards, continuing this idea of reaching the highest note on the keyboard. And once again. And after a very long exposition, the introduction of the themes, in place of what we would expect a development, he writes just a single chord. The exposition ends here. Here is our development. And we are in the reprise. Of course, this is not a development in any sense. It is a linking chord, so he decides to omit the development section completely. Because developments are supposed to be turbulent, they're supposed to be unstable, they're supposed to have long journeys through various keys. And I imagine that Beethoven thought that this kind of approach to music writing in this movement would have destroyed this magical atmosphere which he created. This movement, by the way, is about 12 minutes long. It's one of the longer slow movements Beethoven has written. And if you think 12 minutes in a sonata, which is about 20 minutes altogether, so it is more than half of the sonata is in this stillness. But he was also a perfect judge of proportions, and I think on balance, the intensity and compactness, the energy embodied in the outer movements finds the perfect counterbalance in this very long and drawn out moment of magical standstill. The third time, so after finishing what is effectively the reprise, he goes what seems to be a third time. This time with a little bit more flow, but this is a deception. It is not really a third iteration of the entire thing, but a coda. So from here on we are in different material. And then he adds another coda, as it were, even calmer. The pace of harmonic change becomes slower and slower. And the last 5 bars are just a single harmony, a very long A flat major. As if the music finally succumbs to a slumber, closing its eyes with weary but very satisfied and warm feeling. And then we have the finale. Interestingly, there was supposed to be a fourth movement, a scherzo, and we know what this scherzo was because he kept it as a standalone bagatelle. This is the bagatelle work without opus number 52. It is extremely energetic and very catchy. This motif is something that we remember and keep. So why did he decide to leave it out. And we actually have a writing in one of the sketchbooks saying, for this sonata, the presto, that is the third movement, stays out, because it was very close in tempo and character to the finale. The finale is prestissimo, so even faster, even more intense in its energetic load, but having this lead into this, I'm guessing that Beethoven felt that that would be too close in character, in mood. So what we have instead is a highly compact and highly dramatic finale. It's much shorter than the first movement, and of course significantly shorter than the second movement. It is full of electrified energy coursing through it. At first it's held back. Once again, this idea of repeating things 3 times. Once, twice, and the third time is the one that goes outwards. And again. But then very quickly it really explodes. And then all of this is perhaps 15 seconds, at most 20, and we are immediately, without any transition, in the second subject, which has nothing to do with any of this. It's light and humoristic. Czerny, when he was writing about the sonatas, Czerny was Beethoven's student, apart from being a famous composer in his own right. He gave this movement as an example of Beethoven's incredible and incomparable sense of humor. And perhaps we do not really feel this movement as humorous, but there are elements here which probably, in contrast to the expectations of the time, were perceived as musical jokes. So one of them would be this lack of transition between the ending of the first part and the complete shift of mood. And another humorous moment could be a very interesting chord which he introduces. So the codetta of the first part of the finale. Then he writes a variation, and it should have been once again, but instead it's. So once again, this idea of we're expecting something and we're getting something else. After a really short exposition comes an even shorter development. It is barely 2.5 lines. It starts very light, but because it's so short, in just 8 bars, it becomes dramatic. And then we have something really interesting. So we have a short inkling of the Fifth Symphony motif. So short, you blink and you miss it, but it is unmistakably there. 3 bars that foreshadow, or perhaps not foreshadow, but just happen to have the same motive as we'll encounter many years later in the Fifth Symphony. And that is the entire development, because after that we go back to the reprise. And then, as a further example of Beethoven's humor, as it were, in this movement, we have a coda which is completely unexpected. So we once again have this unexpected chord. And in theory, this is where the exposition ended, but instead of finishing here in some way, he goes into something else. A recitativo-like moment. And then we have our second subject in the very distant key of D flat major. So we were here. We have gone a very... So it's just half a step on the keyboard, but harmonically it is very far. And it is slower than the main tempo and should be played slower and slower. And it stops as if uncertain of where to continue and how to get back to the main harmony from here. This is a moment of harmonic genius. From here, he just raises the bottom note half a tone, and then this leads back into the C minor. And the last bars are fascinating. Most sonatas, well, not all of them, but it was quite common to finish a piece in a decisive and loud way. This was not always the case in Beethoven, not at all, especially in the sonatas that were not primarily conceived for public performance. Interestingly enough, only one sonata, number 28, was performed once before a public in Beethoven's lifetime. All the others were only played for close circles of friends, patrons, connoisseurs. So they were more like a laboratory of ideas which he could develop and experiment on, then taking some of these ideas into his more extrovert works, the concerti and the symphonies. So often if you compare the writing of a sonata and a concerto by Beethoven from the same period, the sonatas will almost invariably be the more adventurous. This is a small aside. But here he ends this highly dramatic movement and sonata in C major and in a somewhat hazy, questioning manner. So it is ambiguous, we're not quite sure what has happened, and it leaves a very strong aftertaste. Once again, one which is extremely different from the aftertaste of the Pathétique, which does indeed end with a decisive run down the keyboard and a C minor chord. So a fascinating early work by Beethoven that I think should be played more often and has a lot of musical and artistic value in itself.